Everyone, and welcome to another video. I know it's been a while, but I'm back on trying to post some more again. And this video, the topic is looking at decks that I think are good for people who just want to get into tarot reading, like beginner decks. And I've got 3 decks for you today, all of which are a bit individual but are really a beginner focused deck to me. The first deck I wanted to talk to you guys about is the OG, the one and only, the Rider-Waite Tarot deck. This deck is probably, it's not the oldest obviously, but it is one of the original tarot decks that kickstarted the more mainstream popularity and acceptance of tarot. It is quite old, or we would expect it to be quite old. It was made by Arthur Edward White and illustrated by Pamela Coleman Smith. And it's the most recognizable tarot deck. It was, I think it's from the 1900s. I have to double check the date. I'll put the dates and specifics about this deck in the description, but it is the most recognizable tarot deck. It's probably the most commonly used one as well. I'll just open the box up for you now. This is not an original edition. This is my copy from the local New Age shop. It comes in this box. Nothing fancy pants. Bit of a history there. And the reason why this is very popular and very good for beginners, that I think personally, is that it is full and full and full of symbolism. And symbols are what our intuition uses to connect to our subconscious and find meaning in things. And this deck literally probably has the most symbolism out of any deck I've ever read with or looked at. So it's not in order, but we can just flick through some cards here. And this is the base deck that a lot of decks produce their versions from. A lot of people produce their versions of tarot decks from. A lot of the images in this deck are definitely reproduced in a lot of other tarot decks. And so what you'll see with my beginner decks that I've chosen here is that a lot of them are just sort of Rider-Waite based decks. They'll have a lot of similar images and symbolism. And I mean, you're allowed to do what you want, but the symbols and the knowledge base this tarot deck was made of is really deep and universal and strong. That's why I think it's become so popular and so easy to use for a lot of people. So let's pick a card here. For example, the Page of Cups. Let's look at some symbolism here. Looking at the actual figure, what he can tell us about this card, he's a young gentleman. He looks a bit naive, a little bit wistful, but otherwise happy and, curious. You've got a single cup in his hand and a fish popping out of it. A fish is symbolism of the intuition, the emotions, all that watery type energy. And then we look behind him and we see the waves are swirling, and they're not quite flat. They're not a deep blue. They're just like the surface. You can see we're touching the surface of intuition here. We're a little bit surprised. Oh my God, there's a fish popping out. We're a little bit taken away with the imaginary and the imagination. And we can see even on his tunic, Pamela has illustrated lilies on a blue background, and then following up into his scarf, overflowing like waves off his hat. There's a lot of symbolism in these cards that we can look at. For example, the Lovers, another deeply, deeply symbolic card. The first thing we see pictured is like the Adam and Eve type scene here. We can see Adam and Eve in the garden. We've got the snake in the tree, and we have, I believe it's the Archangel, I want to say the Archangel Michael. I have to double check because I'm not heavily into archangel symbolism, but we can see the angel guiding over them, a symbol of the Lord's presence, so to speak, in the story of Adam and Eve. And there is just so much symbolism here. The clouds are symbolic, the serpent is symbolic. Adam and Eve being here is not just symbolizing lovers, but it symbolizes choice. The apples were a choice that Eve took to gain knowledge. And that's what the Lovers card is also about, choice and willingness and free will and things like that. So you can see, even just looking at 2 cards, we have a lot of symbolism. The Knight of Swords is another great one. We can see the rushing, charging air energy in the horse's expression, the knight's expression, the way he's raising his sword, the clouds all jagged and in the background, the trees even whipping in the wind. There's a lot of great symbolism in these cards. And once you actually look into some of the symbolism, you gain a deeper meaning and understanding of the card. A lot of it does go pretty deep, so it's up to you how deep you want to take it. For example, some people may not know about the pillars on either side of the High Priestess representing the pillars of the temple. That's quite deep symbolism. But even something simple like the Hermit, we can see there's this grey background. He's alone on what looks like a snowy mountaintop to me. He's got a lantern in his hands. There's a lot of basic symbolism in there that you can just take rather than going too deep with it. That's why I love this deck. I was a bit apprehensive of it at first, and I only got my first proper copy of it a couple months ago, but it is a great beginner's deck. A lot of people will reference to it in videos that you can learn about. All sorts of information is available for this deck for you to help learn the cards and interpret these cards. So I really recommend that. I think every tarot reader should have a copy of this deck. And we'll just do a few more flick throughs. And some of the cards are very straightforward. 3 of Swords. I mean, it is clear that this is not a good card, so to speak. There is some emotional turmoil and things going on in this card just by the rainstorm in the background, the 3 knives piercing the red heart. It's very clear. You can get a lot of instinctual messages off this deck. And yes, the artwork is a little bit old, and things like the Wheel of Fortune touch on like ancient ideas that you might have to read into, but it is definitely a great deck to go deep and gain a real understanding of the tarot with. But yes, I think it's definitely something every tarot reader should have, and definitely a great deck for beginners. I would not, however, personally, I do not recommend going off the guidebook. I think the guidebook is a little bit dated, personally. It's not horrible. I just think you might be best off going off a little bit of a more modern guidebook and meaning of the cards. There's plenty of information online for that sort of stuff. Yes. Most guidebooks I think are good. This one, not my personal favorite. But for a beginner, you could probably reference it and you'd be alright with that to start off with. I'll just put that away. The next deck that I want to show you guys is the Morgan Greer Tarot, and I have the tin copy. I don't know, I think they do make other copies, but this is the most common one that I've seen hanging around. And this is a deck based off the Rider-Waite deck that we just went over. And it comes in, I've got a little tin version. So it comes in this cute little tarot in a tin. And beautiful artwork on the top. This little card, title card. I love this deck because it's got a very fantasy fairy tale vibe to me. A little book. And as I said, it does have a Rider-Waite basis for its artwork. does change slightly. We'll do a little flip through. But again, there's a lot of symbolism here that we can take away and learn with. Even from just the position of people's bodies in relation to you, the way you're looking at this gentleman walk away or this figure walk away, that is a symbol of the meaning. And the other reason I really like this deck is because it goes a little bit further with colors than the Rider-Waite tarot deck does. So it's also quite beautiful. It's more of a sort of more updated artwork. It's still a little bit not quite as modern as it could be because it was made in the 70s, I believe. But it does have this beautiful colors and themes going on that you can relate to and understand the cards better with. And again, it does hold a lot of that beautiful symbolism and goes a little bit further. Like this Ace of Swords has 2 separate flowers and 2 separate leaves coming out of the top of the crown. That goes a little bit deeper with the meanings and the symbols that the Rider-Waite may not. But again, it does have a very simple imagery that any beginner could probably understand if they took the time to look into it. That is why I really recommend this deck. And it does come in a very nice little size that is easy to shuffle. Some tarot decks are huge and they can be quite difficult to shuffle with. But the Tarot in a Tin version at least, is really easy to shuffle with. It's a small, easy to handle deck. And that's why one of the reasons I really recommend it. I mean, this scene, especially from the 8 of Swords, is beautiful. There is a certain emotion that's portrayed in these cards that you can pick up as a beginner that will help you find meaning and help you read a little bit better with. I find that if you can tell a story from the card, then you can read and understand it a little bit easier. Like, for example, this tower image is really strong. It's really volatile to me. It's got a lot of hard-hitting bolt from the blue action going on. And just the angle that it's portrayed at is very daunting as well, which is what this tower card can be about. Not all the cards in the tarot are good cards, so to speak. There is no bad one, but there are some that definitely signify adverse events. And as a beginner, you can be a little bit, oh, I don't know, should I be saying that this is bad kind of feelings. And even as a mature tarot reader, I still get those worries and doubts. But sometimes the message just comes through and you just have to say it as it is. And this tower card is definitely one that I can see that message straight through, that yeah, this is not a good thing that is happening. And that's important as well, because sometimes things are not always perfect, and tarot will just show you that it's not a bad thing to know that something's not right. It's just life. So this is a deck that a beginner might be able to use and convey those meanings easily. Whereas the Rider-Waite doesn't have quite as much emotion to me in the cards. Like this 5 of Cups, there is just definitely a dreary sadness hanging in those dark blue clouds. I'll lift it up so you can see what I'm talking about. So I won't go through the entire deck because it is very similar to the Rider-Waite tarot deck. But it is definitely a strong beginner deck for me. I would highly recommend this deck for a beginner tarot student. Alrighty. And as for the guidebook, I don't mind this guidebook. It's not, again, not one of my favorites. Some of these older decks don't have quite the updated meanings that I would expect. It is still good, obviously, because there is a base meaning for every card that we sort of all go off on, but not as good as it could be. And I'll show an example of a good one in the next deck that I'm going to do. Okay, and this is my third and final beginner deck that I wanted to show you guys. This is the Druidcraft Tarot deck by Philip and Stephanie Cargom, illustrated by Will Worthington, and you can see that my copy is a very well loved, a little bit battered and bruised copy. It comes in this beautiful box. Nothing too fancy, but I really love it for some reason. And actually, the reason I think I really love it is because this is actually the first deck I ever learnt on. I bought this deck online, and it's secondhand copy, and it's the best. It comes with a great guidebook that we'll get into after a bit of a flip through. And it's sort of based off the Rider-Waite, but as you can tell, it has its own little spicy flavor to it because it is the Druidcraft Tarot deck. So it has a Druidic and Celtic feel to it in its imagery and meanings. This is still a beginner deck to me, but perhaps a second deck to buy. I bought it as a first deck, but in hindsight, it does have very specific meanings and messages that perhaps a less seasoned tarot reader might find a little bit confusing. So, let's flip through, guys. I've cropped this deck, as you can probably tell. So there was a white border, but it's gone. And that's probably a good thing because these cards are massive. Shuffling them was very difficult when they were, like, it's very difficult now. And then when they were bigger, it was even harder. As you can tell, mine is very well loved. It's probably going to be the deck that I keep forever. But for a beginner, it's still really good. It still has a lot of that great Rider-Waite imagery going on with an added flair to it if you didn't want just the basic deck. It does, however, change some cards. For example, this card is Cernunnos. I think I'm saying that right, I'm not positive. Which is actually in other decks called the Devil. And it does have the similar imagery of the lovers laying in the field and the devil hanging over them. This deck changes a few names of the court cards. For example, the page in the Rider-Waite is the princess in this deck. But it still has some typical cards and symbolism like justice. You can't get any more specific than this. You have like the Owl of Athena, you have the sword and the scales, and Lady Justice sitting on her throne. So it does have some very typical images, but it has some, as I explained, that are specific to Druidism. We'll continue our flip through. Yes, a very well-worn, well-used deck with a bit of heat damage on some cards. But it definitely, having this deck as a beginner deck, definitely tinted my style of reading. Not in a bad way, but just made it a lot more spiritual, which I think this deck is a little bit more spiritual than perhaps the Rider-Waite deck is. For example, also we have, and I definitely cannot pronounce this word, but this is the Temperance card in other decks, but in this deck it is the Ferulit? And it still has a lot of those temperance images, you know, the two cups being poured into one another, the rainbow in the background, the bright blue sky, but it adds to that Druidic feel and Druidic mythology to the cards, which is a little bit more interesting to me than just the plain Rider-Waite deck. But again, Six of Pentacles, very stock standard looking Rider-Waite imagery there. The Hanged Man, apologies for the nudity. The Fool, very typical Rider-Waite images. And it's in these beautiful images and symbolism and emotion, again, like the Morgan Greer Tarot deck, that I can find these cards a little bit easier to read. This is the Wheel, or the Wheel of Fortune. Princess of Swords. The Ace of Cups in this deck is absolutely gorgeous to me. A lot of that beautiful watery emotion going on. And yes, we'll continue flipping through. I think this is a possible beginner deck. If you want to start off with it, you might need to do some reading, but it is definitely an awesome deck for a beginner. It's definitely doable. We'll flip through a few more cards. Again, this deck also uses a lot of color, more so compared to the Rider-Waite deck. It is a more modern deck, even though it contains ancient imagery. It is more modern. I believe it was made in 2012, perhaps? I'll have to double check that. Again, more information on the decks will be in the description. A different kind of death card here though. I like this deck's interpretation of death. There is definitely a renewal sort of sense going on here. We have the sun either setting or rising in the background. You wouldn't know unless you decided. You have the snake symbol, that an animal which sheds its skin and has a new life. You have I think this is called a bowline knife. It is a knife used for ceremony now, but also used to reap the crops. And the cauldron, which is a symbol of regeneration. Old goes in and new comes out. So this is definitely a different kind of death card, but it's a deeper one to me than just the plain one in the Rider-Waite. The High Priestess is obviously a little bit different. There's less of the Jewish imagery and symbolism and more of a Celtic one, but you still get things like the two towers that she stands between, the Book of Secrets or Book of Shadows that replaces the Torah here. We still have the moon, symbol of the feminine intuition, and it just gives it a different vibe. This is a more active High Priestess to me than the one in the Rider-Waite deck. But all the images are still there. The High Priest replaces the Hierophant. This probably is one of the more different cards, and definitely requires a bit more understanding to fully be able to read than the Hierophant potentially in the Rider-Waite deck. But it sort of mimics the High Priestess, if I see if I can find her again, and that allows a bit more of understanding. We can see, you know, you've got the two towers, different ones again in the High Priest compared to the High Priestess, but we have the sun hanging over the priest, the moon hanging over the priestess. We see his arm raised, her arm raised, different figures, but echoing in meaning that you can look into and understand a little bit better. The lovers is pretty straightforward. We can definitely see that they are lovers. And we can still flip through Prince of Swords replacing the Knight of Swords, but it still has that air energy that we went through before with the wispy clouds, the horse and the knight's expression, the way he's holding his sword. A lot of that fast moving air energy is still there. So it is still a somewhat easy to read deck. The messages are clear, so I definitely would recommend it. If you can trim it though, you will be doing yourself a big favor because it is very difficult to shuffle. We'll just flip through the last ones really quickly. Rebirth replaces the Judgment card. This again is like the High Priestess and the High Priest, something that you might need to read into a bit more than you would with the Rider-Waite deck. So I guess overall I think this is a beginner deck, but a challenging beginner deck. Not one that you can just pick up. If you're wanting to read tarot but get a little bit more into it, a little bit deeper into it, and don't want it just as like, if you want to be a bit more challenged by it, then this is a deck for you, I think. And then what I would like to say is that this has a great guidebook. In the box, it only has the small version, but the bigger version that comes with it is absolutely brilliant. I think the meanings that they give to the cards and the explanations and the mythology behind it is really well explained. you know, they have keywords associated with the court cards and the minor arcanas there based on their number, not just their actual card. And I think this is a really great deck, really a good one, especially if you want to attach a bit more spirituality to your tarot reading journey than just a plain sort of everyday attitude towards your tarot reading, which is fine either way, but there is definitely a flair about this deck, and it goes a lot into spirituality and the tarot and how it can relate to you yourself rather than just the meaning of the cards. So I really recommend this deck. And this guidebook that accompanies with it is really in-depth and absolutely brilliant. So yes. So those are my 3 decks for beginners. If you found this video helpful, or you end up using one of these decks and want to leave any comments or replies or any additional info, let me know below in the comment section. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like, that'd be really cool. If you're on Instagram, you can share it with any other friends who are getting into tarot, etc, etc. And I wish you all best of luck on your tarot journeys. Thank you.